It had been a year since Emily and I divorced. A year of silence, of awkward encounters in mutual circles, and of trying to piece together the remnants of what had once been my life. The house I used to call home felt emptier with every passing day. After the breakup, I moved out of the place we had lived in for 5 years, taking only the bare essentials. The furniture was either too sentimental or too impractical to keep, so I sold most of it and started anew. I rented a small apartment in the city, an area I'd always admired but never considered living in before. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I didn't want to stay in touch with Emily, not at first. The divorce had been a painful, drawn-out affair, the kind where neither person comes out feeling entirely like a winner. It was mutual, or so we said at the time, but deep down, I knew I hadn't fully understood the reason she wanted out. She had always been the ambitious one. She worked long hours at her corporate job, determined to climb higher on the corporate ladder. I had no issue with that initially, as we were both building our lives. But over the years, it became clear that her career was becoming her priority, and I was no longer part of the equation. In the months after the divorce, I did my best to focus on moving forward. I took up running again, something I'd enjoyed in my younger years, and joined a few local meetup groups to meet new people. I spent time with old friends, catching up on what had happened in the time I'd been wrapped up in my marriage. But despite my best efforts, there was always something missing. I missed her. I missed us. One evening, I found myself at a bar, nursing a drink in front of a television screen showing some sports game. It was supposed to be a quiet night, just me and my thoughts. I didn't expect to run into anyone, but as I took a sip of my beer, I looked up to see a familiar face across the room. It was my father. I hadn't seen him in a couple of weeks, and we had barely spoken since the divorce. He had been busy with work and dealing with the quiet loss of my mother, who had passed away 2 years before. He'd never been the most emotionally open man, and I inherited much of that from him. When my mother died, he had withdrawn even further into himself, leaving me to fend for myself in the aftermath of my marriage falling apart. But there he was, standing in the doorway, glancing around the bar as if he was looking for someone. At first, I felt a small sense of comfort. Seeing him felt like a return to something familiar. But as he spotted me, that comfort quickly dissipated when I saw who was standing beside him. It was Emily. I froze. I couldn't believe my eyes. I'd known that my father was dating again after my mother's passing, but I hadn't known he'd started seeing anyone seriously. And certainly not her. The woman who had been my wife. The woman I had shared my life with, my hopes and my dreams. And here she was, standing beside my father, smiling as if they were an old, established couple. My world seemed to come crashing down in an instant. "Hey, son," my father called out, walking over with Emily in tow. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I stood up too quickly, knocking over my glass. I felt lightheaded, disoriented. This couldn't be real. I tried to force a smile, my throat tight. "Dad." "Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Long time. No see," Emily said, her tone warm but with a hint of awkwardness that was hard to ignore. She must have known how strange this situation was, but she was trying so hard to act like nothing had changed. I could feel a rush of conflicting emotions flooding me. Anger, confusion, betrayal, all of them crashing together like a storm. But there was also a dull ache in my chest, the kind of pain that comes from having loved someone so deeply, only to see them move on so quickly. I wanted to ask why. Why her? Why him? How could they have possibly thought this was okay? But my mind was blank, and my body felt as if it were on autopilot. My father pulled up a chair next to mine, while Emily stood nearby, not quite sitting, but close enough to be part of the conversation. "How have you been?" my father asked casually, his tone warm, oblivious to the fact that I was still reeling from the shock of seeing them together. "I know things have been rough lately, but we should catch up." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "I've been managing," I said, my voice shaky. "What about you two?" "I didn't realize you two were." "Well, we've been spending a lot of time together," Emily interjected before I could finish. She seemed more eager than my father to explain, as though she wanted to reassure me about the nature of their relationship. But the more she spoke, the less I wanted to hear it. "Your dad's a great guy, and we've really enjoyed getting to know each other over the past few months. Months? I echoed, almost incredulously. How long has this been going on? A few months now, my father answered, his tone calm as ever. It's been good. I didn't want to tell you this way, son, but I think you should know that we're getting serious. We're thinking of taking things further. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Serious? They were thinking of taking things further? I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream at them both, to demand an explanation. But instead, I just sat there in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Look, Emily said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes softening as if she was trying to be sympathetic. I know this might be hard for you to understand, but we didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. I care about your dad, and I care about you too. I want us to be okay. Her words felt hollow. I couldn't believe how easily she said them. She didn't seem to understand the complexity of what she was asking. How could I just accept this? How could I sit across from them, pretending everything was normal when the foundation of my world felt like it was falling apart? I stood up abruptly, needing space, needing air. I couldn't sit there and let this conversation continue. It wasn't right. I need to go, I mutter, my mind spinning. I felt a rush of heat rise to my face as I walked away, the sound of their voices trailing behind me. The door swung shut behind me, and for a moment I stood outside, taking in the night air. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that my father and Emily were together, or the realization that I would have to face them both again soon. It felt as though the very ground beneath me had shifted, and now I was standing on unstable terrain. Nothing about this situation made sense. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't know if I would ever be prepared for it. But one thing was clear. My life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet understand. My ex-wife was about to become my stepmother, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I couldn't escape the strange, painful reality I had just been thrust into. The days following that night at the bar were a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, but every moment felt strained, like my body was operating on autopilot, while my mind remained trapped in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The images of Emily and my father together haunted me at every turn. It wasn't just the shock of seeing them as a couple, but the deeper, more unsettling feeling that this relationship between them was real, more real than anything I could have ever imagined. I had always seen my father as a man of steady principles, a man who followed certain rules. And yet here he was, dating my ex-wife. It wasn't that I didn't want my father to find happiness again after my mother's death. He deserved that. But it felt like such a violation, not just of the typical boundaries a father and son should have, but of the relationship I had once shared with Emily. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I kept telling myself that it was just a weird coincidence, a temporary situation that would eventually fade away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a phase. This was real, and soon, it would be permanent. My mind raced back to the night at the bar, to the tension I had felt when Emily spoke so casually about their relationship. She had tried to be kind, almost too kind, as if her words could make the whole situation easier to bear. But how could they? She was now my father's girlfriend. She had moved on, and somehow I was supposed to accept that. The next few weeks were filled with fleeting, half-hearted attempts to return to normalcy. My friends tried to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened. How could I explain this strange new chapter in my life to anyone without sounding like I was losing my grip on reality? Instead, I threw myself into work, into whatever I could to distract myself from the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me from the inside. And then, a month later, it happened. The moment I had been dreading, the moment I should have known was inevitable. I had just returned to my apartment after a long day at the office when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, seeing my father's name. A tight knot formed in my stomach. The last time I had spoken to him had been a week ago when he mentioned that he and Emily were planning a small family gathering soon. I didn't respond to that comment. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to think about their relationship any more than I already had to. But now, with the phone in my hand, I knew that this call wasn't going to be any different. I took a deep breath before answering, trying to steady my nerves. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Son, how's it going?" His voice, always so calm, came through the phone. "I've been meaning to talk to you." I braced myself, not sure if I was ready for whatever was coming next. "Sure, what's up?" I asked, the weight of the conversation already bearing down on me. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the slight shuffle of paper, a sound I knew well from our many phone conversations. It was as if he was gathering his thoughts. "Well," he began, "I think it's time we have an important discussion. You know, Emily and I have been spending a lot of time together over the past few months, and we're both very happy. I think you probably figured out by now that this is more than just a casual thing. We've decided to get married." My chest tightened. The words hit me like a hammer. Married. He and Emily were getting married. The shock made it almost impossible to speak. "You're getting married?" I finally managed to stammer, my voice sounding almost foreign to my own ears. I felt like I was hearing someone else's words. "Yes, we are," he replied, his voice steady and untroubled. "We've talked about it, and we both feel it's the right thing to do. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I hope you understand." I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't fathom how I was supposed to react. I had been preparing myself for the idea of them being together, but this was beyond what I could have ever anticipated. Emily wasn't just some girlfriend he was casually seeing. She was going to become my stepmother. I struggled to gather my thoughts, but my mind was spinning. "Dad, I don't know what to say. I understand this might be a lot for you," he said gently. "But Emily and I have been talking about this for a while, and we both feel very good about where this is going. I know it's a lot to process, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." There was a long silence. I didn't know how to respond. On the one hand, I was angry, devastated, and confused. On the other hand, I knew my father, and I knew that he wasn't the kind of man to make decisions lightly. This wasn't some passing fling. This was real. This was his future, and Emily was going to be a part of it. And now, somehow, she was going to be a part of mine as well. "I'll need some time," I finally said, the words slipping out, more to myself than to him. "Of course. Take all the time you need. We just wanted you to know. We're planning on having a small wedding soon, and we'd love for you to be there. I really hope you can make it." A wedding. The thought of Emily walking down the aisle, not as my wife, but as my father's bride, it was almost too much to bear. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice distant. I could feel the distance growing between us, and I couldn't seem to bridge it. "Okay, so, I understand. Just know that we're here, and we love you." His voice softened at the end, almost as if he was trying to reassure me. "I know," I replied. "I'll talk to you soon." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. My thoughts were a tangled mess. This couldn't be happening, but it was, and I couldn't change it. The days that followed were suffocating. I went through my routine with a heaviness in my chest, constantly fighting the urge to retreat from the world and bury my head in the sand. I felt paralyzed. On one hand, I wanted to reach out to Emily, to talk to her and understand what had happened, how she could go from being my wife to being my father's fiancée in such a short time. But I knew that talking to her would only complicate things further. There was no way she could explain this away. The truth was, it didn't make sense to me, and I wasn't sure it ever would. Over the next week, I found myself being drawn into the inevitable. My father and Emily were planning a small, intimate wedding, one that would take place at a quiet venue a couple of hours outside the city. There would be only a handful of people, just close family and friends. I was invited, of course, and I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't avoid it forever. If I stayed away, it would only make things worse. But if I went, I would have to confront this new reality head-on. I would have to accept that my ex-wife was about to become my stepmother. I tried to talk myself into being okay with it. I reminded myself that my father had a right to be happy. I reminded myself that Emily was not the same person she had been when we were married. We had grown apart, and maybe it was time for me to grow apart from the person I had once loved. But even as I told myself these things, I couldn't shake the bitter taste of betrayal that lingered in my mouth. The invitation arrived in the mail a few days later, a formal, elegant card with embossed gold lettering. It was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything I had been trying to avoid. My eyes lingered on the words as I read them over and over, as if hoping they would change. "You are invited to celebrate the wedding of Emily and John." I set the card down on the table, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was going to do. The weeks leading up to my father and Emily's wedding were a blur of emotion, turmoil, and avoidance. I thought I had already endured the worst of it when I first learned about their relationship. But as the wedding date grew closer, I realized that the real test was yet to come. This wasn't just about them being together anymore. It was about me coming to terms with the fact that Emily, the woman I had once loved deeply, was going to become my stepmother. I wasn't sure how to reconcile these two worlds. The past and the present seemed to be pulling me in different directions, and each time I tried to find balance, it felt like I was falling off the edge. I had spent the last few weeks vacillating between anger and resignation, confusion and guilt. Part of me wanted to scream at my father for doing this, for crossing the line in such a profound way. He was supposed to be the one person I could rely on for guidance. And yet here he was choosing her over me, choosing to marry the woman who had been my partner. It felt like a betrayal, not just of our family dynamic, but of everything I had believed in. But the more I wrestled with the emotions, the more I realized that this was my problem to solve. My father had the right to live his life as he saw fit. And Emily, well, Emily had her own reasons for moving on. I was the one still stuck in the past, still clinging to a version of my life that no longer existed. It wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't fair to me. At first, I thought I could simply avoid the situation altogether. I stopped picking up my father's calls. I skipped family events. I told myself that if I kept my distance, I could avoid having to confront this new reality. But that approach only worked for so long. Eventually, my father tracked me down in person. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, staring out at the city. The wind was gentle, and the street below was buzzing with the usual Saturday activity. People out shopping, walking dogs, enjoying the first hints of spring. I hadn't expected anyone to visit me. I didn't have many visitors anymore. Most of my friends had been understanding, but even they couldn't quite understand the depth of my situation. They couldn't fathom what it felt like to be caught between a love that was lost and a family dynamic that was shifting in ways I couldn't control. I heard the knock on my door just as I was beginning to lose myself in the rhythm of the city. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend that I wasn't home, but then the knock came again. This time, it was followed by the sound of my father's voice. "Son, I know you're in there." I sighed, feeling the tension rise in my chest. There was no point in pretending anymore. I opened the door, and there he stood, looking just like he always had, tall, sturdy, a little graying at the temples, but still the man who had always been there when I needed him. Or so I thought. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What's going on? I need to talk to you," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I didn't protest. There was no point. This conversation had been inevitable. He took a seat on the couch, his posture straight, but I could see the concern in his eyes. This wasn't easy for him either, I realized. Maybe he thought that time would heal everything, that eventually I would accept this new chapter in our lives without too much resistance. But I wasn't sure I could do that. "I know you're upset with me," he said, his voice measured. "I know you're angry, and I get it. I do. But I also want you to know that this isn't easy for me either. I never intended to hurt you. I just what, Dad?" I interrupted, feeling a surge of frustration. "You just fell in love with her? After everything? After all the years she and I spent together? How do you even expect me to process that? You're about to marry the woman who was my wife. My ex-wife." I stood up from the chair, pacing back and forth. My father remained seated, but I could tell that my words were hitting him harder than he let on. He was quiet for a moment, and I felt a strange pang of guilt for raising my voice. But then I remembered everything, the hurt, the betrayal, the shattered sense of self, and the anger came rushing back. "I never meant for any of this to happen," my father said, his voice softer now. "I know this is difficult for you. But Emily and I didn't plan this. It just happened. We connected in a way I didn't expect. And yes, it's complicated, but it doesn't change the fact that I care about her. I want her in my life, and I want you to try to understand that." "Understand?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "How am I supposed to understand that? How am I supposed to just let go of everything I thought was real? You're my father, and Emily, Emily was my wife. My voice broke on a last word, and I quickly looked away, trying to hide the vulnerability that was creeping up on me. My father didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, looking at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Finally, he spoke again. I know you're hurting. I can see it. But I also know that I raised you to be strong, to accept life's challenges, and to adapt. This is one of those challenges. You don't have to like it, but you do have to accept it. For me, for her, for the family we've built. You don't have to love her as I do, but I need you to respect my choice. I need you to be there for me. For us. The words stung, but I knew they were true. I couldn't keep running from this. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't have to face it. The reality was that I was stuck between two worlds, and there was no escaping it. I'll try, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. My father nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. It was enough for him. He didn't expect me to accept everything right away. He knew that this was going to take time, just like everything else. I appreciate that, he said. It means more to me than you know. The days following that conversation were a struggle. I had agreed to attend the wedding, though I wasn't sure what I was walking into. I spent hours agonizing over what I should wear, what I should say, how I should act. Everything about this felt foreign to me now. The person I had been before, the husband, the son, was slipping further away with each passing day, and I didn't know who I was supposed to be in this new reality. I remember the first time I saw them together after that conversation. It was at a small family gathering, a pre-wedding dinner that Emily and my father had invited me to. I walked into the room and saw them sitting next to each other, talking and laughing like they'd been doing this for years. They looked comfortable, easy in each other's company, and I hated myself for the bitterness that rose in my chest at the sight of them. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the sense of betrayal that clung to me, as if everything I had known about love and family was being rewritten before my eyes. As I took my seat at the table, I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my jaw clenched tightly. I tried to be polite, to make small talk, but the words fell hollow. Emily smiled at me, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman I had once loved. She was still there, hidden beneath the surface, but the connection between us was no longer what it had been. I had spent so much time blaming her, blaming my father, blaming the universe for putting me in this position. But the truth was, I was angry with myself. I hadn't prepared myself for this. I hadn't given myself the space to grieve the loss of the woman I once thought I would grow old with. The dinner came and went, and I spent most of it in silence. I was there physically, but emotionally, I felt miles away. I could see my father and Emily exchanging glances, could feel the quiet connection between them, and I hated that I couldn't be part of it. I hated that I couldn't just accept it, that I couldn't just be happy for them. Later, as I walked out of the house, I realized that I was only starting to process what had happened. I was beginning to accept the reality of my new role in this family, but it wasn't going to be easy. The emotional weight was still there, the lingering feelings of loss, of betrayal, and of confusion. But I knew that I couldn't keep running. I had to face this, just as I had faced every other challenge in my life. I didn't know where this journey would take me or what my relationship with my father and Emily would ultimately become. But for the first time, I felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could learn to coexist with this new family dynamic. The wedding day finally arrived, and with it came an overwhelming sense of finality. It felt like everything in my life had been building toward this moment. The culmination of months of unease, internal struggle, and reluctant acceptance had led me here, standing at the crossroads of a future I wasn't entirely ready to embrace. I had tried, in my own way, to come to terms with my father and Emily's relationship. I had spent sleepless nights wrestling with my emotions, desperately seeking a way to make peace with the reality that Emily, the woman I had once been married to, was now about to become my stepmother. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had forced myself to talk to Emily more. I attended a few small gatherings that were meant to get us all comfortable with each other. At first, it felt like a performance. I could hear myself laughing at her jokes, nodding at her stories, but there was a part of me that remained emotionally distant. I was doing my best to keep the peace, to act as if nothing had changed, but deep inside, I was still struggling to accept this new dynamic. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about how everything had shifted without my consent. I wasn't ready to let go of the past, but life had a way of moving forward, whether we were ready or not. I had tried to imagine this day, my father standing at the altar, waiting for Emily to join him. I had envisioned myself as a supportive son, smiling proudly as they made their vows. But in reality, I was dreading the event. I couldn't help but think about what it would mean for me. I wasn't just going to be a guest at my father's wedding. I was going to be an unwilling witness to the final shift in my own identity. No longer would I be Emily's husband. No longer would I have the same place in her life. No longer would my family be the same. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early, still feeling the weight of everything. I had avoided looking at myself in the mirror for weeks, but today, I couldn't help it. As I stood before the glass, I wondered what the person staring back at me would look like after today. Would I still be the same man who had shared his life with Emily? Or would I become something else entirely? I dressed slowly, carefully choosing my outfit. I hadn't been sure about the details of the wedding, whether it would be a grand ceremony or something more intimate, but I knew that whatever it was, I had to be there. I owed it to my father to show up. The past was no longer something I could hold on to. I needed to let it go, to find a way to move forward, even if it meant accepting things that didn't sit well with me. When I arrived at the venue, I was immediately struck by how beautiful it was. It was a small, elegant place tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by nature's stillness. There were flower arrangements everywhere, and the scent of fresh roses filled the air. The atmosphere was serene, yet there was an underlying tension that I could feel in my bones. Everyone was so happy, so excited, and I couldn't help but wonder how they all felt, knowing the history between the bride and the groom. To them, this was just a love story. But to me, it was a complicated web of emotions, of nostalgia and regret. I was ushered into the small chapel, where the ceremony was set to take place. The guests were already gathered, the sound of soft chatter filling the air. I took my seat near the back, scanning the room for my father and Emily. I saw my father talking to a few people near the front, his face beaming with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in him in years. And there, next to him, was Emily. She was radiant in a simple, yet elegant white dress. She looked beautiful. There was no denying that. And yet, as I watched her, I felt a pang of sorrow. I wondered how she felt, standing there about to marry the man who had once been my father. As the ceremony began, I couldn't shake the feeling of being caught between two worlds. This wasn't just my father's wedding. It was the end of something else. The end of the life I had once thought I would have, the life I had shared with Emily. I tried to focus on the vows being exchanged, on the promises being made, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the past. I thought of the love we had shared, the moments we had spent building our future together. And I thought of the day it all came crashing down, the day Emily and I decided to part ways. We had agreed to move forward, but I hadn't realized at the time how much I would struggle with it. But as the ceremony continued, something began to shift in me. Maybe it was the sincerity in my father's eyes as he spoke his vows. Maybe it was the way Emily looked at him, with the kind of love I had never been able to give her. Or maybe it was just the realization that this moment was no longer about me. It was about them. It was about their happiness, their future, and their love for each other. And if I truly loved them, if I truly cared about their well-being, I had to learn to let go. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness wash over me. The knot that had been tied so tightly in my chest for months finally began to loosen. It wasn't that I had fully accepted everything. I wasn't sure I ever would. But in that moment, I understood that my happiness didn't have to depend on the past. I didn't need to hold on to the memories of the life I had lost. What mattered now was what lay ahead, the future I could still shape for myself, even if it meant learning to accept my new role in this family. The reception that followed was filled with laughter, music, and a celebration. My father and Emily danced together, and I watched them, still processing everything that had just happened. It was strange seeing them as a couple in this context, but there was no denying the joy that radiated from them. For the first time, I realized that their love wasn't a betrayal of the love I had once shared with Emily. It was just another chapter in our lives. I had been holding on to the past for so long that I had forgotten that life went on, whether we were ready or not. I found myself joining in with the other guests, smiling, laughing, and even sharing a few moments of genuine connection with some of the people who had been close to my father over the years. I didn't let myself think too much about the future. I didn't need to. The day was about them. And for the first time in months, I was able to let go of my anger and disappointment. Later in the evening, after the ceremony had ended and the guests were beginning to leave, I found myself standing alone near the edge of the dance floor. My father and Emily were surrounded by well-wishers, and I felt a pang of loneliness. I knew that things between us would never be the same, but that didn't mean they couldn't be good. As I watched them, I realized that I had a choice. I could continue to resent the changes in my life, or I could embrace them. I wasn't sure how I would fit into this new family dynamic, but I knew that I didn't want to live in the shadow of my past forever. I had to move forward just as my father and Emily had. I took a deep breath and made my way over to them. When my father saw me approach, he smiled, his eyes filled with pride. Emily turned to look at me, and there was something in her gaze that softened the sharp edge of my emotions. She didn't expect me to forgive her all at once. She didn't expect me to love her like I once had. But in that moment, I realized that we didn't need to go back to what we had. We just needed to find a new way to be a family. "Hey, son," my father said, his voice warm. "I'm so glad you're here." I smiled and nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I'm glad too, Dad." And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past wasn't something I could change, but the future was still mine to shape. I could choose to move forward, to accept the things that had happened, and to create a life for myself that was defined by new experiences and new connections. I didn't have to let the past hold me captive. It would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. As the night wore on, I found myself laughing, talking, and even dancing a little with the guests. And while I wasn't sure where this new family dynamic would take us, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that I could face with strength, resilience, and maybe even a little bit of hope. The wedding was a turning point, not just for my father and Emily, but for me too. It wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was ready to find out.